Hello everyone and welcome to our Period 6 exam review. And I just want to remind you that this is the exam that I am personally going to be giving you. This is not a complete review that we would do when we start getting ready for the final exam, the nationwide exam in May for APUSH. So again, just focus on what is in this review so that you know what it is that I will be testing you on. So let's get started. We'll start in 6.1, Roman numeral 1. So we're going to go through the key concepts just like this and look at technological advances of the time period. And railroads were the first big technological advance they had. Communications were also very important, telegraph and eventually telephone. But it's the railroad that becomes especially the very first big monopoly. And remember, the government at this time period does give railroads subsidies. They did it in form of land grants, helping them to build the railroads. This is something that later on the populist parties, we'll talk about later on in the slides, will oppose this for various reasons. Now we might ask, well, why did the government give subsidies to the railroads? Well, it helped them to open up new markets. As you built the railroad west towards California, you opened up and you developed new towns, new cities. This opened up new markets, new possibilities for economic growth. This became very important to the government. Although a couple of negative consequences come from this. There was the destruction of the bison population, for instance. They also began to tear up all the various prairie grass in the area, which eventually would lead to a very negative consequence by the 20th century. We also know that during this time period, as industry began to flourish and other industries, steel, for instance, begins to grow towards the latter half of the 19th century. Many industrialists began to redesign their financial and management structures. We talk about horizontal integration, vertical integration. Right? This is what eventually starts to create trust and monopolies. It allowed them to start taking over other industries. In vertical, they began to control every aspect of production from every stage, from the steel to building whatever you're going to build out of the steel to even the trucking and the shipping. So this is how they began to really focus their wealth at the time period. They were turning from just focusing on consumer goods and starting to focus more on the capital good. And that's how these men like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, how they became multi-millionaires and even billionaires. Workers, your concept tells you they did begin to enjoy some higher wages and some better working conditions at times, but there's still, as we're going to see, as labor grows, there's still going to be a lot of fight to get even better wages and better conditions. But in some of the industries, things do eventually get better. Well, let's look at the rise of labor. And I always like this cartoon here. Right? We see monopoly versus labor. It's pretty obvious who's going to win. As the industrial workforce is expanding at this time period, we have internal migration. People are leaving east and going west. People are also leaving the rural sections of America and heading into the big cities where all the factories are. Plus, we have a new wave of immigration coming from mostly southern and eastern Europe and also parts of Asia. Labor began to really focus on battling management, and they fought on several things. They did fight for better wages, and like I said in the other slide, in some cases they actually did get better wages. They fought for better working conditions. They also formed their various unions to fight, to help them organize to fight capital. They also were opposed to child labor, as their labor base did increase because of immigration. That helped their labor base to increase as more and more of these immigrants, as I mentioned, coming over from Eastern and Southern Europe. They also have a very specific goal where they want to stop government and big business from unifying. We see that in a lot of cases at this time period, a national industrial workforce is sort of what big business would like to have and like to get government to help them do that. But labor will fight in order to stop that. And we don't quite have that in this country. One of the big first labor movements of the time are the Knights of Labor. Of course, they don't. What eventually brings their downfall is the Haymarket Riot, which really they had nothing to do with. That was in Chicago. If you remember, again, you have your cheat sheets on this, so you can go back and look on these labor unions and the various strikes and riots that took place. The Pullman strike is very important as well to take note of. You have this moment in Chicago again, another situation in Chicago where they're trying to unionize the railroads, and Grover Cleveland sends in the military in order to stop it. So again, please look back at your cheat sheets on labor union. So a lot of that is going to be where you get your information from. Also, this concept does end with the idea, and I put that in here because there'll probably be a question on your test. A lot of this change promoted by Southern leaders also who were promoting what they called a New South. They're bringing in textile mills into the South for the first time. However, remember, many of the agriculture that's still being produced in the South was based on sharecropping. Last thing we talked about in class was this Agrarian Revolt. That's 6.1 Roman numeral 2. Farmers becoming way too dependent upon new types of technology when it comes to agriculture. This mechanized farming that's developing. They're also way too dependent upon railroads. And these things begin to hurt them. It begins to eat into their profit and how they are able to make a living. They also saw the corporate consolidation of their farming. Many of these corporations are taking over things that we think of today, like Post Cereal and General Mills. They began to form their local and national cooperatives in order to try to protect themselves. The one we talked about in class specifically was the Granger movement. They even began to create laws in order to protect themselves from the railroads, predominantly in the state of Illinois. The Populist Party comes along eventually. It comes out of this farmer movement. Their main goal is to reform and to regulate. They want to reform government from the bottom down. They believe this, the government has lost the ideas of Jefferson. They want to reform it. They want to regulate big business, have greater control over the monopolies, especially railroads. They become very worried about the growth of corporate power and the economic instability. Remember, we have the Panic of 1873, or the Crime of 73, as the farmers called that. They begin to worry about the Panic of 1893. They have very specific issues about inflationary policy. They want to add silver to the system, 16 to 1. Remember that ratio, 16 ounces of silver to every 1 ounce of gold. They want more paper money. They want all this stuff working together. Whereas the Republicans of the day, they want deflationary policy. Eventually, the Democratic Party will join with them in this currency revolution that takes place that I was talking about, inflation versus deflationary policy. And it culminates in the election of 1896, where the Democrats and the Populists basically join together. They nominate William Jennings Bryan, his Cross of Gold speech, where he's referring to J.P. Morgan's bailout gold of $60 million during that Panic of 1893. And they try to bring back an agrarian socialist type of government and economic policy. But as we know, the Republicans win. And in 1896, William McKinley is president, and this agrarian movement comes to an end when they lose this election of 1896. I do not ask you any questions about the Wizard of Oz, though. I know that's fun, but I decided not to put that on this test. 6.2 now. Roman numeral 1, we got into urbanization. Massive cities are on the rise, which led to a lot of economic growth in America, which attracted all kinds of new immigrants from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Asia. And they took advantage of the economic growth that was happening here. And they also sought out new career opportunities, even though there's a lot of nativism, anti-immigration, xenophobia, and racism that was thrown at them. They still found a lot of career opportunities here. They tried to assimilate into American culture, but even as they assimilated, they still wanted to hold on to various aspects of their culture. Always remember that. That's why we have places like Chinatown and Little Italy even to this day. The Chinese Exclusionary Act was the one law ever passed against one specific group of people. That's the Chinese. Now, also, we learned about the political bosses here, the political machines that were in all the major cities. This is how they Both the Democrats and Republicans would gain control of smaller cities, and eventually throughout using that, they would gain control of the state government and eventually began to affect the national government as well. Using immigrant was a huge power base for the political boss. They took advantage of them by giving them certain public services. They would give them, let's say, public parks. They bring in water and sewage into the cities. They'd also give them jobs and a place to live. Not the best place to work, definitely not the best place to live at all. But they controlled them by giving them those things. They demanded in return their votes. And that's how the political bosses became powerful in this time period. And eventually settlement homes will be created to help these individuals better and pull away from what the political bosses were doing and help them to adapt better to American culture. And I'm going to bring this up again later on in another slide when we talk about reform that takes place. We did talk about Plains Indians at the time. This is 6-2, Roman numeral 2. As I mentioned early, we get a decimated bison population, which is what the Plains Indians depended upon greatly for every resource they could possibly have. Due to competition for land and resources, this is what led to increased violence. As more and more white settlers come west, they want the land. They want all the resources that are being discovered out here. Gold is being discovered. Silver is being discovered. Iron and copper and zinc and eventually oil. All of this led to violence and the Plains Indian Wars. They moved Indians eventually by the end of these wars that happened. Indians are going to be completely isolated onto reservations. They also want to force Indians to assimilate to American culture. We get the Dawes Severity Act, which is about land ownership. It is also aimed to end tribal identities. They don't want Indians to start identifying themselves only as certain tribes. They want to start thinking collectively as Native American Indians, and then hopefully the idea of becoming American. This is not going to work. And eventually the Dawes Severity Act goes away. This is an image of the Carlisle Indian School, where they took children from the reservations and began to strictly enforce this idea of assimilating to American culture. Learn to read and write and speak in English. Learn to dress like an American. Act like an American. In a lot of respects, this was very bad. They often forced these children through harsh punishments to become American. But as we also talked about, there were some positive things. Many of them became social activists for Indian causes. The Carlisle Indian School eventually became a college and even had a football team, a very famous football team, that a lot of things that we think about in the National Football League today, that football team invented. For instance, the spiral pass, as we talked about in class. 631, we got introduced to the capitalist philosophies. For instance, social Darwinism. This is not tied to evolutionary theory. This is a philosophy that gets developed to begin to justify why they were successful and why the average white person who was poor could never be successful. It was also a racist ideology as well that separated the races. It ties into, in your world history, white man's burden. There were those who were critics of this and fought against it. Those who began to merge the idea of Christianity with socialism, various artists, agrarians, utopians, and socialists, they had an alternate vision of the American economy, one that did not support this consumption, this idea that Americans need to be more in it for everyone and not just for themselves, not so self-centered and greedy, but more caring and understanding of the social good for everybody. Andrew Carnegie wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth. Now, he becomes a philanthropist, and he does believe that the rich have a duty or an obligation to help the poor. However, always remember, he still believes in social Darwinism. Even in the book, The Gospel of Wealth, you can see aspects of social Darwinism in there as he justifies why there are leaders on the planet which are very few, and everyone else must then in turn listen and follow their lead. Critics, again, began to challenge this. Other critics challenge what they called the dominant corporate work ethics of the day. Again, the ideas of social Darwinism, the idea of superiority, and that sort of stuff. There was reform in the Gilded Age. We had this concept start off with the idea of the political party still lingering with Civil War divisions on tariffs and currency. This does eventually lead to political reform because there's corruption at all levels. It starts with Ulysses S. Grant as president. We got credit mobilier scandal, the first major scandal that involved a president with Grant, many members of his cabinet, and his own vice president, perhaps even his own brother were involved in this. This fake construction company that didn't even exist. We also have to reform civil service. You may remember the party patronage system where you were helping people get elected at the local levels. You got party patronage, which meant government jobs. That eventually led to the assassination of James Garfield, President of the United States, and eventually they reformed this by giving us the Pendleton Act, or civil service reform. New roles for women as they began to get more involved in the economy. They also take on that old reformer idea that women had pre-Civil War. Many of them became urban reformers, like Jane Addams. She is considered the mother, if you will, of settlement homes. Hers was in Chicago, the Hull House. Again, helping immigrants to better assimilate to American culture, learn the ways of American society, and thereby avoid all the nonsense that the political bosses were doing. Jacob Riis, also, we talked about him during this time period. He published his book, his picture book, his photo book, How the Other Half Lived, in 1890. Helped open up our eyes to what was actually going on with immigrants in those tenement homes and how terrible it was for them and why it was important for us to be involved in this type of reform. We also have this issue that takes place with African Americans after the Civil War. We get the idea of, during Reconstruction, a golden age, they're very involved in politics, they're very involved in society, but with the end of Reconstruction, everything begins to collapse and segregation starts to rise. Two leaders of the time, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, these men had different ideas. Remember, Washington has his famous Atlanta exposition speech where he talks about cast down your buckets where you are. He's thinking of the new opportunities of the New South in industrial and agriculture. And by accepting segregation, African Americans can better themselves economically. And eventually, white Americans will begin to realize that segregation has to be stupid, and he's thinking eventually it goes away. Whereas Du Bois starts to fight over this, and he wants civil rights and civil liberties now. He wants segregation to end now. And he wants African Americans to think beyond just agriculture and technical skills. He'd like them to get them into poetry, into English, into philosophy, and to broaden the mind of African Americans. So he had the two opposing views of the time period. Segregation becomes a solid reality in the South with the Supreme Court decision of Plessy v. Ferguson of separate but equal. You should know it was a 7-1 vote, with one of the judges abstaining and not really casting a vote. The one vote against it was one of the judges who truly believed that the Constitution is colorblind. Every person is equal before the law, and that really is the Constitution. Plessy v. Ferguson is a terrible court decision that eventually does get overturned, and we'll get to later on in history with Brown versus Topeka. But with this vote in Plessy v. Ferguson that establishes separate but equal, and eventually what we come to call Jim Crow laws by 1901, this will end all the gains that African Americans had from the Reconstruction period in the South. And separate but equal becomes the dominant force. that even affects the North, even though they try to act like it's not there. It's there. It's everywhere. And we get into period 7. We'll touch upon that again. And of course, period 8 will get us to the civil rights movement. And these things will constantly be with us as well. So that brings us to an end then to this review. Again, I went maybe a little quick, but you can always watch this at your leisure. Watch it again and again and again. If there's any questions that you're not sure of, you can always come and ask me. I hope everybody has a really good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever it is you may be watching this. All right. Bye-bye.